right, guys, welcome back to another edition of Texans Unfiltered, a Houston football podcast, a podcast for your Houston Texans. I am Young Ari Gold, a.k.a. James, and I am here with another James. My whole week has been full of James. It was James Palmer. Now it's James Roy. And I'm excited to have this conversation with James Roy because James Roy just started a YouTube channel. I would say, maybe a month ago, James?
It was roundabout, I'd say about 2 or 3 weeks, yeah.
And a lot of his videos that he's done, I've felt were great, like very logical approach, optimistic, not looking to shit on the Texans, and then also looking to just have a conversation. Like if you disagree, let's have a conversation. And I think that goes a long way. So James, why don't you introduce yourself and tell them about you, the channel, what made you want to do it, and all that other stuff.
So James Roy, my actual last name is Ramirez. I know I don't quite look it, but I am a 1/4 Hispanic. I've been a fan of the Texans since 2002. I was 7 years old at the time, so I didn't really have any ties to the Oilers. I was living in Houston at the time. My dad and the rest of my family's Cowboys fans, and I guess I wanted to be different, but we were also in Houston, so it makes sense. I've always loved talking about, the Texans and football in general. But when I got out of high school, I joined the military. So I never really had the opportunity to be consistent at pursuing any sort of an outlet to post about that in the social media age. But recently I got back on Twitter, started posting. I like to think that I'm an optimistic fan, and it seems to be the feedback that I get. At the end of the day, the way I see it, regardless of what the Texans do, I'm still going to be a fan.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can be frustrated with what they do. I can give honest critique. If they go and pick Will Levis with the number 2 overall pick, I'm the first to admit that that's my least favorite option at that pick. But I'm not going to renounce my fandom and move on from the team. I'm just going to find a way to justify it because they decided to do that for some reason. So with that mentality in mind, I can kind of go in to my observations and my views on how the Texans do things with a little bit, I don't know. It's not all or nothing for me. It's just kind of let me logically think through what makes sense and then put it out there. I don't know.
Yeah. I think one, and you said a lot there. If we just go to the Will Levis, I think you think very similar to me. It's not the guy I want, not the guy I believe can be the quarterback we need, but they believe in Levis and they took Levis. So I'm going to hold off judgment and I'm going to give him the opportunity to show me that he's either going to be that quarterback or he's not. And if he's not, then we'll talk about it. And if he is, I'm wrong. And it is what it is. We're wrong half the time. I'm just glad the franchise got it right. Is that more in line with kind of how you view it?
Yeah. So, last year, right, Davis Mills, I bought a Davis Mills jersey. I went in and I did research. I was Davis Mills would have been a first-round pick if he had gone a year later, and I found every reason to justify it. I've already started doing research on Will Levis in preparation. I looked up and found his yards per completion and compared it to Pat Mahomes in 2016, and I'm at a lower volume, but similar production on average. This guy's only problem is he throws more picks, but he didn't really have a good supporting cast, and he's not an air raid offense. I'm already trying to make it make sense in my head so that I can, try and get on board if the Texans do that. That's where I'm at right now.
And I think it's probably the fair, it's out of our control at the end of the day. We all have our guys that we like, but the chances of them drafting the guy we want are very. I love Jonathan Mingo. I want Jonathan Mingo to be drafted by the Texans. I think he would be a guy that could really be a number 1. But if they don't draft Jonathan Mingo, there's nothing I can do about it. It's funny you mentioned Davis Mills because I'm put in the category of a Millicite or whatever they call it. I don't know. They call us Mills believers or someone that thinks that Mills could be okay. Some kind of stan. I still think nobody knows what Davis Mills is, if I'm being honest. I think it's very hard for anybody to say Davis Mills is trash or Davis Mills is an average quarterback. With the situation he was in, there's no way for anybody to tell me what Davis Mills is.
I agree with you. And honestly, if I'm making comparison now, before I was alive and I'm not fully familiar with the situation, but I know that Brett Favre wasn't drafted by the Packers. Brett Favre was drafted by the Falcons. Brett Favre maybe played a game or two, didn't exactly show the Falcons what they wanted, and the Falcons traded him. And guess what the Packers got? The Packers got a perennial Hall of Famer, or a perennial producer that, obviously threw the most picks in NFL history, but won, a Super Bowl and got it done. So my biggest concern moving forward as someone who just doesn't like to let go of something that could be good is that the Texans move on from Davis Mills, send him to another team, and he does really well there. But, obviously, like you said, we haven't really seen – we've seen flashes, obviously. But and I just recorded the first episode of the podcast I released today. And on it, I talked about how when we saw Davis Mills this year and we're comparing like the positional value of quarterback versus edge at the 2 pick, and we see that we can look at the team and we can look at how the run defense did, and we can pretty much assign a lot of the blame for why the Texans were bad to the run defense. We were within 1 score of winning a game, 10 games out of 17 this year, and realistically should have won. But on that same note, there were situations where Davis Mills had the ball, the offense, had 2-minute drill, and you go down and you score and you win. That's what elite quarterbacks do, and Davis Mills didn't pull through in a lot of those situations. So there's fault on both sides, which is why I can kind of make sense of going quarterback or edge at the 2 pick.
Yeah.
I think it's important to address quarterback, but I would not be mad if they, called Will Anderson's name at the 2 pick.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up Brett Favre. I think it's a very good comparison. I think we can actually even go a lot more closer to home and go Matt Schaub, who had nothing in the league, no idea what he was going to be. He was just a backup. Gary Kubiak trades for Matt Schaub. All of a sudden, within that system, Matt Schaub develops and looks like he was a franchise guy, if we're being honest. He wasn't ever an elite guy. He was never I would say I don't know. Maybe you can make an argument he was a top 10 quarterback, but fringe top 10, led the league in passing yards, did all these things. But at the end of the day, I think if you look back in revisionist history, the Texans made the right decision trading for Matt Schaub and bringing him in, and it worked out. And so I see Davis Mills in a very similar light. I don't know if Davis Mills is I don't believe Davis Mills is Pat Mahomes, any of the top elite quarterbacks in the AFC. But I do believe he has the opportunity to be like a Matt Schaub, a Kirk Cousins. And I think when you take into consideration what the system actually is, I think that might be okay if the system is what it was in San Francisco. So, so interesting conversation to start off with. Didn't mean to start with Mills. It's never good to start with Davis Mills on a YouTube video because people tend to tune out as soon as you do it. But looking at the draft, I mean, it's tomorrow night. Obviously, you have your thoughts and like what you'd like to see him do. Where like ideally, if you're looking at where this Texans team is currently, the roster isn't as depleted as it was when Nick Caserio took over. There's some pieces there now. In an ideal way, like what would you do? What would you want them to do at 2-12?
So obviously, I actually had an exchange with Lance Zierlein earlier in the offseason over Jalen Hyatt. And I think he said it best when he was talking to me. And he said, I eat film and you just watch the game. So like, obviously I'm not an expert and I'm not going to like suddenly know what the Texans should do. I'll be the end all be all, but like personally, if I'm going to this draft, it all hinges on whether or not Bryce Young's still on the board at 2. So if the Panthers, if it's to believe that they're considering any other option, they haven't officially told Bryce that he's the guy, but I don't think anyone believes that he's not. If Bryce is on the board, you go Bryce at 2, and then you go with like Jackson Smith and Jigba, unless the Titans take him, in which case you go, with whatever's the best edge prospect at that position or defensive tackle. But if Bryce Young is not available, then I personally would probably consider trading back or going Will Anderson, and then taking you could still go receiver at 12. But you might consider going quarterback at 12, maybe. Like ideally for me in that situation, the only reason I would go Will Anderson at 2 is if I had the assurance that either Will Levis or a quarterback that's in the top 4 falls to 12, because I'm not trying to take Hendon Hooker at 12. if he's not there, or if Hendon Hooker's the only option at 12, I'm probably waiting till 33 and risking not getting a quarterback that high in the draft. Honest, but that's just how I see it.
Yeah, I think for me, I agree. I'm in a very similar situation. I think if I'm looking at it now, the way it looks like it's going to go, if Bryce Young is QB1 and he's taken by the Panthers, in an ideal scenario, if they're not in love with a quarterback enough to take at 2, I'd like for him to trade back. I don't believe they'll trade out of the top 10. So like the Minnesota talk, the Commanders talk, like I think that's a little far-fetched, because you're moving out of, and people say this draft is not a great draft. And one GM says that he only has 15 first-round grades on 15 players in the first round. So like you don't want to move out of that top 10. Maybe Raiders, maybe Falcons, maybe Colts. That's been floated around out there. Nick addressed it on Sean and Seth in the morning. I would like to see him trade back if they don't love a quarterback or they don't love an edge prospect enough to take at 2. I'm kind of also with you at 12. Like, if you're not going to, unless one of these quarterbacks fall, which I believe, honestly, one of them is going to fall out of the top 10. I do. It's just the way the draft goes. One guy slips. It's typically the AR type of quarterback that slips because there's not enough experience,
Which would be nice. It would be nice to see AR slip there. I think that's the perfect spot to take him as the project that he is.
Yeah. I think project is a bit rough, but I get what you're saying. I get it though. I get what you're saying. People are saying it. I would say inexperienced. I don't know if I would say project, but he is also technically a project, right? So I think if he does fall to 12, either him or Levis. Like if we're being honest, the 2 quarterbacks we probably would expect to fall to 12 would be Levis or AR. Do we both agree?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I think we know CJ and BY are going to go in the first 10 picks. So if one of them is there, great. But Nick's going to move one of those picks, whether it's 2 or it's 12. Nick, I can't see Nick standing pat at both picks and just taking a player. I think he's going to move back. I think he's going to want future capital for future drafts. But if not, I'm not on the wide receiver train. I guess it all depends on what happens when, if they take at a 2 or they trade. If they address defense, then maybe a tight end or a wide receiver. If Bijan Robinson is there, I've always been against taking a running back in the first round. But the flexibility that Bijan gives you, being able to line up at wide receiver, line up at running back, I think he gives you a ton of flexibility in this offense. I'd be intrigued by Bijan at 12, and supposedly the Texans like him.
Well, I think that the only reason so contemplating Bijan as being the running back in the system, obviously we've got Dameon Pierce, but I think I am of the understanding that Bijan Robinson is like a generational prospect. So you take a chance on him if you have the option to. But the only reason I would personally is when we look at, you mentioned Matt Schaub earlier. One of the things that made Matt Schaub a truly, serviceable quarterback, in my opinion, was the offense that, Gary Kubiak ran with the zone running and the play action would put, teams respected Arian Foster so much that Schaub would boot out into the field. No one's looking for him. They're looking for Arian Foster because they think the ball has been handed off. And then Andre Johnson was a monster, and he's deep, and Schaub had a good enough arm to get it to him. And that's really – so if you're going to go that route and you're going to get Bijan, you'd hope you already have that Andre Johnson type receiver, and, you make teams respect your run game and then do these boots and get some deep throws going. But I don't think the Texans are at that stage. I'm also a firm believer that I have a 6-year rule with running backs. I think that truly great and elite running backs can push for 6 great seasons. Derrick Henry recently passed that mark. He is a truly elite running back. Ezekiel Elliott did that. He had 6 truly great seasons. Christian McCaffrey's had like 3 or 4, and so he has to push to have 2 more, right? So with that in mind, you expect to get about 6 good years out of Bijan if he is who he says he is. And so if we draft him right now, Marvin Harrison Jr. is in the next draft. We could look at getting a true wide receiver 1 and setting up that offense. But I don't know if I want to pursue that right now, knowing the shelf life of the running back being the way it is.
I am literally you every year. Every year I feel the exact same way. for some reason, I just feel differently about Bijan. I think one, having Damian is such an important piece to drafting Bijan because now he's not the workload running back. So now you're extending his career automatically in year one. You have a guy that can literally split the carries with. You can line him up at wide receiver. So now you're already extending that career potential of going to 6 years, maybe 7 years. But you're right. Like the positional value of the running back, it's tough. But when you look at it and say he's the best offensive player in this draft, it's like, can you not find a way to make that work? And if so, like during that 5 years or 6 years, like, I mean, this team, if we're being honest, James, like what does the window look like for when they'll be competitive in your mind?
I mean, I would say 2 to 3 years. Another situation that I think about when I think about what I'm talking about with Bijan Robinson is the potential for a trade for Lamar Jackson, which is that on the one hand, you have Lamar Jackson, you trade for him, you give up 2 first-round picks and give him the money he wants on a nice, 5 to 6 year deal, right? And then at the end of that deal, if you haven't built the team around him and he doesn't feel good, then he's out, or maybe he gets injured and he's out, right? Whereas if we drafted a Bryce Young or a CJ Stroud or a quarterback in that top 12, right? You look at a guy who's on a rookie deal, 5 years, right? You pick up his option and you have time to build around him. And then when he's ready for that big deal, you have the team built around him, and then you can give him the big deal and you get 6 years of great football from him, ideally, right? So for me personally, signing Bijan Robinson to that 5 year deal and using his 5 or 6 good years to build around him, you don't have that option. Running backs don't usually get that second deal that's like a huge, blockbuster deal, right? They produce on rookie deals and maybe an extension that's signed on that. And then you're looking to find a guy who can spell him, and you're creating that like the Cowboys did. Tony Pollard. If Tony Pollard doesn't pop off, the Cowboys don't do well this past year, right? Like they really and having lived in Memphis and followed Tony Pollard's career, I could have told you he was going to pop off like that, and I was glad to see it. But I mean, so you can't. But all that to say, I mean, the Texans can spend all this time thinking about how it's not a good time to do this and not do it, but then you risk the team remaining forever desolate and not winning games, and you go to NRG Stadium and you see an empty stadium because they don't want to take a risk getting the talent into the building. So like, I wouldn't be mad about the Bijan pick, but it's not what I would do.
Yeah. And I think that's totally fair. Like I said, I'm right there with you. And normally it's very, very, very hard for me to just say, hey, let's take a quarterback at 12. I don't know. Maybe it's because I live in Austin and it's like I've seen what this kid can do more and up close, but I agree with you. All right, so we're looking at that. So your final picks. This is it. This is what you think the Texans are gonna do tomorrow night at 7:15 when the second pick is being announced. Tell me what happens at 2 and tell me what happens at 12.
So I used to have more certainty that CJ Stroud was going to be the pick. I know that the leaked S2 scores may or may not have any validity. I've seen it go both ways, and I can't really use that as the sole reason or really any reason to make a decision on Stroud. But obviously, as someone who doesn't have those sources, my only source for affecting my opinions really is just what I see around and trying to vet what big name sources are saying. And I would say the S2 score, while it may or may not be real, it does heavily affect the way that I view whether or not the Texans will draft him, even though they're not using it, because the S2 score would be a reflection of the film, and the Texans are using the film to evaluate CJ Stroud. So if the S2 score is telling you that he might not be good at the next level, I would trust that the organization has seen that in the film and has determined that they don't fully believe they'll take him. So at 2, I could expect them, if they don't trade, to go. I think Tyree Wilson's more the build that they want, but I think it's hard to pass on the production that Will Anderson had at that level. Now, granted, I've seen some advanced stats that show that Tyree Wilson's not as much of a project as people would make him out to be. So I could see it being one of the two. Personally, I would go with Will Anderson, so I'm going to say Will Anderson. At 12, if you go Will Anderson, I'm looking for Will Levis to be available. And if he's not, then I'm just going to have to take, Jackson Smith and Jigba. And these are both players that could very well not be available at that pick, in which case I would trade out.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I think my final draft prediction would be I do believe it's Will Anderson at 2. I think a lot of it has to do with, one James Palmer was talking about, and he put it out before he actually came on the show. Like, supposedly he is just like the greatest human being in the world of human beings. And when it comes to like being a coach in the locker room and somebody that D'Amico can count on, he is that guy. He's the guy that's going to lead the defense. He may not be Myles Garrett or Joey Bosa, but he's a guy that D'Amico can go to. He could be a mentor. He could really do the things that D'Amico wants to do on defense. So I think Will Anderson is likely the pick at 2. 12, I think if a quarterback falls, they'll take whichever quarterback is there. I think if a quarterback doesn't fall, I think they'll trade back and likely take like a Zay Flowers or maybe another wide receiver later. Maybe a Jordan Addison, who I'm not a big fan of, but, it seems like this offense is really built around in space playmakers with elite speed and being elusive. I think Addison fits that characteristic. So I would go that path. I think that's what they're going to do. We're both going to be wrong, James. It's just the way it goes.
I'm prepared for it.
I am too. I'm just excited. I think it's the first time. I mean, last year I was excited. This year, for some reason, my excitement level is a little bit higher because I just think, even given all the smoke around Nick Caserio, and I loved your video on Nick. I really did. I thought that video was very good. I've said it for years. Like, Nick Caserio is the only general manager to ever inherit a team like this. Like, there's not in the history of the NFL, there has never been a GM that has inherited a franchise quarterback requesting to be traded, having 26 sexual allegations against them, no cap space, no draft picks, and not only that, a completely depleted roster outside of tackle. There was no other piece on this team other than left tackle and right tackle.
But Ari, he got us where we are because he was just doing his job.
Yeah, it's so weird to me. It's so weird to me. And then not only that, like I do, and I say this all the time, like the way he handled the Deshaun Watson trade, he will forever be a hero in my mind. Yeah, and I'm sure you remember it. In 2021, during the trade deadline, the Dolphins were offering 2 firsts, and fans, media, everybody said, you got to take it now. You got to take it now because you don't know if you're going to be able to get anything. And Nick basically said, fuck that. I'm going to hold out for the top amount I can get. And he did. And I don't think any other GM in the league would have held on to Deshaun with what was going on. It was just bad press. There was just so many things about it that hurt this team from a PR perspective. But ultimately, it was the right decision to be able to do what's best for the team in the future. And I will forever think that he handled that better than anybody could have.
I agree, and I understand why some people are down on him. Obviously, it's frustrating to see at the trade deadline that there was a deal in place to, deal Cooks for, like, I believe it was a 3rd-round pick was the rumor, and to get what did we get, like a 5th or 6th round pick for him?
Yeah,
it is frustrating. It's not necessarily how you want it to go, and in general, there was a couple moves he's made that are kind of head scratchers, and then there's the contingent of people that just don't believe in Derek Stingley. To say bust is a strong term. It's a term that I've used for what people think of him. But, after 1 year, if you're calling someone a bust or saying they can't be better than another player from the draft class or they weren't the right pick, you're not evaluating enough time to make that decision. Derek Stingley can still be better than Sauce Gardner. That's not a knock on Sauce Gardner. And I wish Sauce Gardner the best. I personally wanted the Texans to take Sauce, but they didn't. And Derek Stingley's on the team now, so that's the guy that I want to be great.
Yeah, I like Stingley. I think he could have played last year, from what I've heard. I believe he could have played, but there was no point in playing. It didn't really not going to help anything. Like let him rehab, get ready for the season. According to James Palmer, none of these cornerbacks, according to the GMs in the league, are on par with Derek or Sauce in this draft. And it looks like, from what I heard, all of the general managers, it was like a toss-up between Sauce and Derek. So, I mean, you kind of live and you learn. You can't. What can you do? You took a cornerback. He has elite traits that you value. He's a man corner. He didn't play in a man system. He played in his own match scheme. And I think he'll thrive in D'Amico's defense. I really do. And it's going to come down to being healthy. But you can't judge a draft pick after 1 year, just like Kenyon Green. I think it's easy for us to all shit on him and say he wasn't good, and I can't disagree with you. He wasn't good. Doesn't mean he can't. Doesn't mean he can't develop. Doesn't mean that missing a center didn't impact his development because he was having to, there's so many different elements that go into it. So, all right, James, I'm going to let you get back to it. Tell everybody where they can find your channel, where they can find you on Twitter, where they can find you on your new Instagram that you started, all of that. Tell them where they can find you.
So I just started I got offered a podcast and I just dropped the first episode. It's Texans Takes with James Roy. It's under the Bullpens network. It's on their RSS feed. So that's where you can find it, is under, if you search the Bullpen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, it's there. As far as social media goes, I'm an M1 Texans fan, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. So that's where you'll find me on there.
Awesome. Well, keep up with the shorts, because I don't know if you know, but this game is all about the shorts. It's not about 30-minute videos. It's about 5 to 10-minute videos. So keep that up, because that's where you're going to make your money.
No, yeah, I'm getting ready to cut up the podcast I just posted to get some clips from it. So
awesome. Well, cool. Well, James, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. We'll definitely do this again. And with that being said, I hope everybody has a good draft night tomorrow night. I hope it all works out the way that you guys are hoping. Not everybody's going to be right. That's okay. We can all have a conversation about it. We don't need to be right. We just need the team to be better. And with that being said, Young Ari Gold signing off for Texans Unfiltered. We're going to catch you guys next week.